Hello and welcome to Who Needs Western Civ, a podcast about liberal arts and classical education. I'm your host, Clay Green, a postdoctoral associate at the Hamilton Center for Classical and Civic Education. I'm joined today by Carlos Casanova. Carlos is an extremely accomplished senior scholar and lawyer. He holds a Venezuelan law degree and a PhD in philosophy from the University of Navarre in Spain. He has published 9 books, very impressive, and has worked in the office of the Attorney General of Venezuela and served as an assistant to the Venezuelan Supreme Court. To list all of Carlos's appointments would take up half the show. I'll just say he is a visiting faculty here at the Hamilton Center, so I get the chance to talk with him a lot. He's an extremely kind man, a devout Catholic, devoted father, husband, and a great friend. So, Carlos, thank you for joining us here.
Thank you for inviting me, Clay.
I'm looking forward to talking to you a little bit about your background, but I thought we might start, since you are a philosopher, we might start with a big question and see what you can do with that. How does that sound?
That sounds good.
What is Western civilization? Is it a meaningful term?
Of course, it's a meaningful term. The Western civilization is a civilization different from many other civilizations. It was born more or less in the 9th century. That's what Auguste Comte said, and I think in that he was right. In all the rest of things he said, I don't know, but in that he was right. And the birth he points out as the birth to the foundation of the Frank Empire, the Frank Roman Empire. So at that moment, the West became like a unified whole, and it was the Latin Christendom. So it had a language, a common language among the cultivated person, which was Latin. It had a tradition, a religious tradition, and also a philosophical tradition. And it was very different from the Greek Christendom, which was Byzantium, which was a real and an authentic remnant of the Roman Empire. The Western Roman Empire at this time was a fiction, really, but interesting fiction that had a lot of consequences. So it's clearly a separate civilization, and it has its own traces, it has its own growth, its own tradition. So of course it makes sense, to use the term.
I'm interested in the fact that you picked a medieval. You said 8th or 9th century.
Yes.
9th century, I think. So this is the age of Charlemagne, right?
Yes.
That is the origin of Western civilization, as opposed to saying that. I think something that others have said, maybe I've even said on this podcast, that Western civilization has its origins or its first expressions among the Greeks, maybe.
I say the birth of Western civilization. Its origins are far back, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. They are far back, but the birth is that day is the birth of the civilization.
Well, I want to push you a little bit on that issue of the fiction of the Roman Empire. Obviously, Romanness or Latinity, whatever you want to call it, was very important to the understanding of the European peoples in the Middle Ages. But like you said, it's a strange kind of association because it's not an actual empire. It's this common language, a kind of set of understandings about the past. Obviously, the church is involved there. Could you say a little bit about what the significance of kind of living in this, almost the ruins of the Roman Empire, did for Westerners and the kind of self-understanding of Western civilization? Another big question, I know.
Yes, I follow on this. I follow Christopher Dawson. He has fascinating.
Could you just say who he is? I'm sorry to interrupt, Carlos, but
Christopher Dawson.
Okay.
Dawson. He has amazing research on the origin of of Europe. And he says that it has three roots, which is the Roman Empire, and with everything that it had in it, because the Roman Empire had Greek philosophy, and it had also the influence of the Jews. Then he says the second root is the barbaric peoples, the barbarians, and the third root is the church. So those three elements combine and form the Latin Christendom, which is the origin so it's Western civilization in its inception. Now, one thing that he shows, and other authors too, like Toynbee, is that the conquests of Rome really set a standard in the minds of the barbarians that were around. So when they made the empire crumble in the West, they felt that something was missing. So they wanted to rebuild it. And then another important influence in this sense was Justinian. Justinian, he had this idea that Rome was the whole Mediterranean zone. So he fought to rebuild that, and he succeeded for 5 years or something.
Yeah, like the mid-6th century.
Yeah, politically, it was a failure, 6th century, It was a failure politically. But for the future, it was extremely important.
Oh, interesting.
Because it gave to the West the idea that they were a political unit. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So from that time on, although he destroyed the first the first Gothic empire, Ostrogothic, although he destroyed the first Gothic empire, he gave to the gods of Spain and to the Franks the idea that this was a unit. So from then on, all the barbaric peoples strove to build this Western empire, and they were in the beginning crowned by the Byzantine emperor. That's interesting. Until Charlemagne. In Spanish, you say very different. That's why I don't know well how to say it in English. But until he decided to be crowned by the Pope.
Right.
So the Pope is the one who is going to give me the authority. No, the Byzantine emperor. So at that moment, the West broke the umbilical cord with historical Rome, let's say, and started a different adventure. But the empire existed. You know what I mean? It existed, only that its power was strong among the Frankish kingdom, but very, very weak in England, very weak in Ireland, very weak in Italy. Its unity was more like, how would you say that? It was more spiritual. That's why I say it was like a fiction. And when in the beginning of the 10th century, it crumbled, or the end of the 9th century, because it was attacked from the south by the Sarracenos, by the Muslims, from the north by the Vikings, and from the east by the Hungarians. So it was impossible. It just crumbled.
The Magyars, right? The Magyars? Yeah.
But the Magyars, which were later the Hungarians.
Right.
So when that happened, I think a series of miracles occurred because the Vikings, they defeated the Christians, but they were amazed at the Christian religion and culture, so they converted. And the Magyars, the same, they converted. And that was a pattern that happened once and again in the Western history. Like that happened with the Goths, that happened with many peoples. So they converted, and that gave the chance for the empire to restart in the 10th century. So the Ottons and the Pope allied and formed again the Western Roman Empire, which was it was called the Roman Empire. You are amazed when you see the sources. they speak about the Roman Empire, but they mean the German Empire.
Right.
Yeah, we now know that, but in their mind, it was the Roman Empire.
But like you say, it's kind of a spiritual thing. I think about Dante, or many people in that age who have this idea that there is an emperor, or there should be an emperor always, right? It's like a spiritual concept, like you said.
But it has a very interesting phase to it, because the Byzantine Empire was an actual empire, and it had inherited the whole Roman idea of hegemony. And also there, the patriarch was very much and normally controlled by the emperor. It was while in the West, the Pope, who was the Western patriarch, was very much independent. And moreover, the moral authority of the emperor relied on the Pope.
Yeah.
I mean, so that made the following difference. Very important. Many kingdoms, like the Magyars, united the Western Empire while preserving their independence. So they acknowledged the emperor, but they were actually an independent kingdom. But in case of war, they fought for the West, let's say. Mm-hmm. While the Byzantines, since they were really Roman, they wanted to conquer, you know. So, for example, Bulgaria converted to Christianity and was a very powerful kingdom, and it was like a Greek Orthodox kingdom. But the Byzantines always feared Bulgaria, so they ended up destroying it. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. They destroyed in the West. That very rarely happened.
They were doing the old Roman peace of creating a desert and calling it peace, that kind of thing.
Yeah, wherever they had the power, they just actually conquered.
One more piece of the European picture, just because I know you studied at University of Navarre and you know Spanish culture very, very well. You know, when I think of quintessential Western European countries, I think France and Germany, right? There's nothing more, there's nothing more European than French and Germans fighting over Alsace-Lorraine. That's Western Europe in a nutshell. But it seems like the Iberian Peninsula has its own particular history here. I didn't prepare you for this question, so if you don't have something in mind, that's okay. But before we go to the New World, is there something particular about the Spanish wing of Western civilization that's worth pausing over, saying something about?
Of course.
I knew there would be, Carlos. You're an easy interview. I should just carry around a recorder when we get coffee, and I'd have many podcasts.
Well, when Charlemagne founded the empire, he also founded the palace school, and the palace school was the Renaissance of classical culture in the Frankish Empire, the new Roman Empire.
Carolingian Renaissance, sometimes called.
Yeah. And then he brought monks from England and from Ireland, but he brought monks from Spain.
Oh.
The monks from Spain were very important, and also from Italy, of course, because the movement came from Italy. But Spain, had been at the end of the Roman Empire, it was part of the summit of civilization. The Goths had assimilated the Roman culture very deeply. So when the Goth kingdom collapses with the divisions that it had and the invasion of the Arabs, not only Arabs, but I don't know how to say the other words in English. So the Arabs and the Africans, when it collapsed, well, it took refuge in the northern part of the peninsula, but many fled to France, and they were a very important element in the in the Carolingian reform Renaissance, and later Spain became like a center of dialogue between the Muslim, the Christians, and the Jews. And it became the source of knowledge of Aristotle very much. Although we shouldn't forget that the Venetians conquered Byzantium.
You're talking about the kind of empire of Venice. Is that what you're?
So the city of Venice,
yes,
conquered Byzantium, and they ruled Byzantium for several decades.
Yeah.
So Italy had a very tight relationship with the wise men from Byzantium. That's something that people don't know. Italy and Byzantium were in constant, intense relationship in all these centuries. It's upsetting when I hear that the Renaissance in the 16th century happened because Constantinople fell and the wise people came to Italy. That's ridiculous. It's completely ridiculous. And the Renaissance did not happen in the 16th century. It started in the 12th century. Well, that's a different, the other Renaissance, besides the Carolingian one. So Spain, in that encounter of the three traditions of cultivating science, was very important, very important. And many of the greatest wise people of the 12th century were Spanish. You know what I mean? And Italy, of course, was also very important. I mean, really, truly, Germany and France, so Germany especially received the science from the Mediterranean. They are just barbaric peoples who were illustrated by Spaniards, Italians, and French people. In the beginning. Of course, that changed, because what happened in the 10th century is that the Ottons were the guys who had the strength to restart the empire, you know what I mean, with the Pope. So that changed the situation. Yeah. I don't know. Yeah, but it's upsetting to me when I see so much crazy propaganda that say that Spain is part of Africa. So ridiculous. So, you know, it's absolute ignorance and propaganda.
Yeah.
It was when you read Sienkiewicz's novels about Poland.
Yeah, great. I love those novels, by the way. I love those novels, by the way. Yeah, fantastic.
Very good.
Fantastic. Yeah, all of them.
All of them are what?
All of them are amazing. I always recommend both those novels, those historical novels, and Quo Vadis.
Quo Vadis is so good.
Great. Yeah, absolutely amazing.
Good. But there he talks about the different knights of Europe, and of course Spain is there. You know what I mean? And Aragon was like of such importance. Like, for example, Aragon organized a military expedition to save Byzantium, and they defeated the Turks. And you know what happened? Why then the Turks came back? Because the brother of the emperor of Byzantium was jealous of the Catalonians. So he invited the officers to a supper and killed them all. So that the troops, who were 10,000 Catalonians, were enraged. They took Byzantium, sacked it, and went all the way of the coast to the Greek peninsula, and took Athens and formed a kingdom that lasted 100 years. I mean, Spain is like central, vital to the life of the Western civilization. What happens is that since Cromwell called Spain the essential enemy, then as you told me one time, and I know, then there is this like loads of propaganda against Spain. You know what I mean? It's something upsetting to me, but well.
I completely understand.
Yeah.
Have you ever heard the phrase the Black Legend?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
I have a book on the Black Legend.
Oh, you do? Okay.
One of my 9 books is about the Black Legend.
My Spanish is okay, but it's not quite good enough to read your books. Probably, I could give it a shot.
But I have a paper which has like a sketch of many of the subjects of the book in English. It was published in Logos.
Okay.
I think it's online. I think you can access it online.
Yeah. So for free. You can correct me on this. My understanding of the Black Legend is, well, for one thing, it's everything that we probably know from pop culture and things like that about the Spanish Inquisition, for example, that Spain was, I don't know the best words, backward, oppressive, especially violent. And a lot of that, as you're saying, is partly English propaganda in the
and
age,
Dutch.
And Dutch too, right? These two powers that were starting to try to flex their imperial muscles especially the 17th century, but the 16th and 17th century, late 16th century. And at the time, of course, Spain was the great imperial power. I mean, Spain was everywhere. So maybe that's as good as we're going to get, a transition to talking about Spain in the New World. And let's zoom out a little bit. You were born in Venezuela, right?
Yes.
And I'm always interested to know, is Latin America part of Western civilization? What do you think is the relationship there? We're talking about these broad historical formations. It seems like, based on the way you've described Western civilization as having these political parts to its identity, but also these cultural parts to its identity, I could see ways that Latin America would or wouldn't fit. So what's your sense of Latin America and Western civilization? And do you even like the term Latin America? Maybe you don't. I don't know.
Yeah, look, I first of all, I don't like the name Latin America. That was a French invention of the 19th century. So I'm not Latin American. I am Spanish American. And well, Ibero-America can be used too, but I am Spanish American. And well, when you read not the Black Legend, but the real history of the conquest and the organization of the American Spanish Empire, the Spanish American Empire, you realize that it's, I don't know, I'm all the time tempted to swear, but I have to refrain myself. It's so upsetting, the amount of lies that there are about this. But I'm going to take the chance to recommend a couple of books. Like William Prescott was a Puritan from New England, from Boston, I think. He was blind. I admire him very much. He wrote. He loved Spain's history, and he wrote a book on the conquest of Mexico, a book on the conquest of Peru, a book with several volumes. Well, each of these books has 2 volumes, I think. And then a book on Philip II, a book on Elizabeth and Ferdinand, and a book on Charles V. So he has lots of literature. And I recommend his books on the conquest of Mexico and Peru, because he started with a lot of prejudices as a Puritan that he was. But when he encountered the documents, he really straightened the thing. You know what I mean? He abandoned his prejudices and he said the truth. Although his prejudices are in his books, that makes them even more interesting. He corrects them slowly as he's writing the book. You know what I mean? Well, and there is also a book that I learned about just in May or June. which is The Cross in the Sand, Florida's history. That book is excellent, and it used to be a textbook for history of Florida at the University of Florida. No longer it is, but it's an excellent book. Okay, in these books and in many other sources, what do you find? Well, you find that the Spaniards, when they came to America, by the way, Americo Vespucci, who gave the name to the continent unjustly, but he gave the name to the continent, he didn't come to the US, he came to Venezuela. So we are America, we are not South America, we are America.
Yeah, America, yeah.
Well, okay. Yeah, so as I say, Americo Vespucci didn't come to the US, he came to Venezuela. Okay, when they came to America, they immediately founded cities when they conquered. And those cities had the plan of the European Spanish city. And in that city, you had the central square, all the streets in a square. Then you had the church. The first building they built was the church. Then the town hall, and then the governor's house. And then the rest they distributed equally among the neighbors. And they immediately formed the town hall. For example, one story I thought when I was preparing this is this. In Caraballeda was the main port of Venezuela in the 16th century. But then a governor came who wanted to appoint the mayor of Caraballeda. And the neighbors said, well, you are crazy. We elect the mayor. You cannot appoint the mayor. And he insisted. And you know what the neighbors did? They abandoned the city and founded another city, which is La Guaira. So La Guaira became the port of Venezuela, although the Bay of La Guaira is much worse for ships than the Bay of Caraballeda, because the governor tyrannically wanted to appoint the mayor. You know what I mean? So then there are many other things. For example, the first universities were founded in 1550 in what today is Dominican Republic, in Mexico and Lima. And they were excellent
You've got Harvard beat by 100 and something years.
Exactly. And then there is an excellent book by a Cambridge scholar, which is called The First America. The scholar is David Brady. I recommend that book too. It's really excellent. He shows how this was like a very powerful and flowering civilization that was entirely Western. It was like a transposition of the Latin Christendom. And then there is this myth that they killed all the Indians. That's ridiculous. I mean, in Florida, for example, the missions in the north had all the Indians in the missions until a British badman, let's say, murderer, came from Carolina and with Indian allies, killed them all. His name was Moore. And that happened in 1702, I think. So there were many Indians in Florida until Spain sold it to the US, and then the Indians were exterminated. So the Spaniards didn't exterminate the Indians. It is true that the population was reduced very much in the 16th century, but that was due mostly to plague. Like in Hawaii, when the British came to Hawaii at the end of the 18th century, I don't remember now the numbers, but it was something like there were 200,000 Hawaiians. And 100 years later, there were only 10% was left. Only 10% was left. But due to sicknesses, you know what I mean? So the same thing happened in Spanish America, like many died. And one thing that the US people should know is that half of the US was Spanish. Half of the US was Spanish. It's not only Texas or California, it's Nevada. Even the Russians and the Spaniards met in North America. That's something. And Florida was not just Florida. Florida was Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, part of Mississippi to Louisiana, and on the west it went up to Virginia. That's why in this movie by The Patriot by Mel Gibson, he shows the missions in Virginia, because there were missions in Virginia. Um, and the Spaniards really had this idea that they had to assimilate the Indians, and that was very well done. That's something that was. I'm going to make a parenthesis. I love Prescott, although he has this prejudice, but there is one point in which he was deceived, and you mentioned it earlier. That's why I think it's good to mention it. And it was the Inquisition. Why? Because the last secretary of the Inquisition, when Napoleon entered Spain in 1808, Llorente was his name. He was a priest, but he was a Mason. So he said that he was going to publish the archives of the Inquisition, and he published like a book telling all the horrors of the Inquisition, and it was all lies. But everybody believed him because he was the last secretary of the Inquisition and a priest. So Prescott believed him, Dostoevsky believed him, and Newman believed him. Only much later, really, the files were published in the 20th century, and we know exactly how the Inquisition worked. Like the amount of people that in 400 years the Inquisition gave up to the secular power to be killed was 4,000. You know what I mean? Henry VIII killed more people than the whole 400 years of the Inquisition. He alone killed more people than the whole 400 years of the Inquisition. And we know now too that the Inquisition never forbade a scientific book in Spain. In Italy, it's a different story. But in Spain, the only thing that the Inquisition did was to command that some passages had to be excised from medical books, for example, that say that we don't have free will because the brain determines behavior. Those passages were excised from the books. Well, I don't know. I mean, there is so much evidence about how the system was. What happened is that in the 19th century, when the Spanish Empire collapsed because of the invasion of Spain and all that happened here, the new governments many times were anti-Spanish and anti-Catholic. That was very much so in Spain and in Venezuela and in Mexico.
Yeah, I wonder, can I just underline this so that maybe we can have a slightly new topic? Well, it's what you're talking about. I just want to draw attention to the transition. So the 19th century, Spanish Empire collapses, wave of new nations in what, with your terms, we'll call Spanish America. How is that a new phase for this part of Western civilization, this Iberian American branch that we're talking about? This is Simon Bolivar, and there are some things that listeners might be familiar with here. Can you situate us there?
Yeah, well, so up to that point, up to 1810, the whole Spanish America was a civilization, and everything was very similar everywhere. I mean, there were many differences. There was intense commerce between the different regions. There was a lot of cultural exchange, but that changed with the collapse of the empire. So every country took a different path, really. There was something in common, but every country took a different path. So in Venezuela, the new governments were very much anti-clerical. And in Spain too. There were like huge religious persecutions in Spain, like horrible in the 19th century. It was horrible. But in Venezuela, when Bolivar ruled in 1813 and 1814, Caracas had 90 seminarists at the beginning of that year. At the end of that year, Caracas had one seminarist, one. because they drafted them and put them in first line in the fight against a barbarian guy who was Boeth. So in Venezuela, the new system was very much anti-clerical. They after Venezuela was, well, I don't know, it's a long story, but so after the independence, Venezuela was joined with Colombia and Ecuador. I don't know if you knew that. It was the Great Colombia.
No, I didn't know that.
And in 1830, it broke apart, the Great Colombia. So Venezuela became a different country. At that point, the new government expelled all the male religious orders in 1832 or something like that. And later in 1836, they allowed usury, which was forbidden in the Latin Christendom and also in the Spanish American Empire. So, and with usury, there was a huge impoverishment of the population, and that gave rise to many wars in the 19th century. I don't know, but the fate of other countries was different. Brazil, for example, is interesting because Brazil became the center of the Portuguese Empire. The king of Portugal came to Brazil to live.
It's a little bit like Rome and Byzantium, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that lasted until 1880 or something like that, 1881, something like that. So the fate is very different, and the story is very different. In Ecuador, Ecuador was about to disappear in 1870 because the Colombians and the Peruvians were going to crush it. And then a great leader came. I forgot now his name. Well, a great leader came, and with the veterans of the Independence War, he reorganized the army and defeated Colombia and Peru. And then he ruled Ecuador for 18 years. And that was the Republic of the Sacred Heart. And Ecuador really flourished at that time. But in the end, he was killed. And you know who gave the order to kill him? It's amazing. Bismarck.
Oh, wow.
Bismarck.
Was he assassinated?
Because he was fearing...
Was he assassinated?
Assassinated. Because Bismarck was fearing a renaissance of the Catholic world, and he saw in this guy...
Yeah, he was fighting... He was, the culture conf, right? He was fighting Catholicism inside his own country.
Germany.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he was fighting against the Catholic Church, but he saw in this ruler of Ecuador like a huge example for all Catholic countries. So he thought, we have to eliminate this guy. And he did through a Colombian hitman. Well, I don't know. But one thing that we had in common, though, in general, is that I think maybe this will make you nervous, but through the Masonic lodges, there were several waves of influence. So we became liberal. All of us liberal, then all of us became positivist, and later in all of our countries started the communist, the Marxist influence in the 1920s, more or less.
Yeah. So I learned relatively recently that in a lot of these, maybe not all of them, but in some of these Spanish American countries, the Masons were a liberalizing force, and the Masonic Party was often the liberal party. Isn't that right?
Yeah, well, it's more complicated than that. In Venezuela, both conservatives and liberals were Masonic.
Oh, okay.
So there was a fight among them, you know what I mean? And then the Catholics were many times put in prison. You know, it was like a horrible tyranny.
Maybe the better word than liberal then would be anti-clerical. The Masonic parties were the anti-clerical parties.
Yes, anti-clerical, yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And in the 20th, well, in the 19th century, the Liberal Party won a war in 1864 4. I think, yeah, the war ended in 1864, and they did this. They expelled the feminine religious orders because the masculine had already been expelled. They suppressed the seminaries, and they intervened the universities, closed the schools of theology and philosophy. And appointed a rector, which was completely against the Western tradition, because the rectors were elected in public universities and in private universities. Well, appointed a rector to intervene the university. But so we had 2 universities. One of our universities resisted, and he couldn't control it. But the other one couldn't resist because it was too close to him in Caracas. So they did all this. So their idea was to decapitate Christianity in Venezuela. And in the beginning of the 20th century, a Masonic friend, an author from the US, wrote that actually they had succeeded. There was no Catholic culture anymore. But it was false. It was because many bishops founded like underground seminaries, and then, yeah, and also there was exchange with Colombia. So some of our youth went to Colombia to study, then came back. And there was one great guy, which was Caracciolo Paraleon, who really single-handedly like recreated the Catholic culture in Venezuela in the 1920s. And I think he was killed in 1939 or so. I think he was poisoned.
How is Christianity in Venezuela today?
Well, so I would say that really these anti-clerical movements had lots of success until 1998. For example, all the students' movements up to 1998 were Marxist, and many intellectuals were Marxist. But with Chavez, who was a Marxist, a totalitarian one, there was a reaction. That was amazing to me. There was a reaction, so that the opposition to Chavez from 2002 on became mostly Catholic. So there was like a renaissance of Christianity as a reaction against the communists. But I don't know if that can have future, because they have more and more power. Like so the universities resisted the attempt of the government to control them, because in Venezuela and in Latin America in general, we have this strong idea, in Spanish America, we have this strong idea that universities are autonomous. Public universities are autonomous. The government has no right to appoint a rector or a dean. They have to be elected by the professors with participation of the students. Well, so in 2001, the government tried to control the universities, and we resisted. I was there. And the government was unable to take control. But so what the government is doing now is just destroying the universities, since they can't control them. For example, the university where I was, Universidad Simón Bolívar, which was one of the best, has no budget. So a professor earns there per month a hot dog. So something like $30. you get your money, and then you can go and buy a hot dog and a Coke. So they have to work in other things, and they teach only for love of the art.
So starving them out, basically.
Yeah, they are doing that. So I don't know how it's going to end, but for 15 years there was a renaissance of Christianity. But they killed a lot of people. Well, it's a long story. I don't know. If I enter there, I would be talking for a long time. I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let's pull back a little bit and talk a little bit about communism, which you mentioned. You lived in Venezuela. Venezuela today is a communist country. How is it? Well, I could ask you a lot of questions about communism, because I know you have both firsthand experience of it, but you've also studied the writings of Marx very, very closely. There are a couple ways I could go. Maybe just to start, when did communism come to Latin America? I'm sorry, Spanish America, and did it have influence throughout the continent, or was it did it especially flower in places? Was it allied with these nationalist movements early, or is that something that happened later? Maybe just situate the story of communism in that part of the world.
Yeah, it happened later. You are going to be surprised, but the first communist.
So I'm always surprised by everything you say, Carlos. Yeah. I always get I see the world. It's like Ralph Waldo Emerson said that if you ever get bored, you should looking at the same street, you should lean over and look between your legs and look at the street, and it'll look completely different. That's the way it always happens when I ask you about anything, Carlos. It's like looking at it upside down. So go right ahead. It's a pleasure.
So Jose Vasconcelos, who is an author that I love very much, he's a Mexican guy. He was Minister of Education in 1919, something like that. Well, in his memoirs, he tells this, that the first Latin America who became a Marxist and went to the Soviet Union to study in 1918 had a scholarship from the Methodists of California.
Okay. Does this end up being the English and John Wesley's fault that
no,
that communism
I don't. I think the Methodists of California have nothing to do with John Wesley. You know what I mean?
Oh, I see. I mean, okay, fair enough.
When they did that, I think they were connected to Rockefeller, actually.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So Rockefeller has a lot to do with this story. Yeah. With this
story of Rockefeller has something to do with the story of communism
in Latin America.
Latin America.
Very much, yeah.
Go on, Carlos. I can't wait to hear it.
Well, okay, so it started relatively late because it was 1918 when it started, but it went very fast. It went very fast because in the 20s already, communist parties were founded, I think, in every country of Spanish America. The first modern political party.
It's pretty big in Spain as well, right? It's pretty big in Spain as well, right? Communist party in Spain is also.
But in Spain, it started much earlier.
Okay, yeah.
It started much earlier because in Spain, the Masons had this institution called the Institución Libre de Enseñanza, so like free institution of teaching or something like that. That institution promoted anything anti-clerical.
Okay,
gotcha. And very early they started to promote Marxism. For example, Antonio Machado, who is a great Spanish poet. He was introduced into Marxism, although his poetry is too good to be Marxist, really. I mean, yeah, he has some touches of atheism, but you see that he suffers with it. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
He's an atheist, but he regrets it.
Misery can create some beautiful poetry. Look at Baudelaire. Even self-imposed misery, right? Someone someone torturing themselves with their lifestyle or their ideas or whatever else, that can create a kind of aching beauty that's wonderful to behold sometimes.
Well, I think he avoided this kind of subject. So he became like a poet of Spain or something. But when he entered this subject, you could feel that. You know what I mean? And he's excellent. I mean, his rhythm and his rhyme is excellent. He's excellent. But you had that since the beginning of the 20th century in Spain, or even the end of the 19th century. It came later to Spanish America. But it went fast, though. and I think it's because of the Soviet organization. Like they immediately started to organize and fund like centers of diffusion, etc., of the communist ideology.
Help me out with the years here. We're talking.
The end of the 20s in Venezuela was founded the Communist Party, if I remember correctly. I think it was like 1928 or something like that.
Okay.
And it's the first modern political party. Venezuela had parties in the 19th century, but they were not modern in the sense that, I don't know, they were like caudillos parties. And they were caudillos party in every sense. I mean, they were armed movements. They were not like opinion movements. They were, well, I mean, they had opinion organs, they had press, they had all this, but really they came to the ground of honor very quickly.
Okay.
I mean, it's like,
so Stalin would be the dominating figure.
No, it's before, like, well, yeah, very quickly. In the beginning, it was more like abstract, but very quickly they became Stalinists. Yeah.
Yeah, I know that there's there's quite a large connection of communism, especially to Spain. I know that there was fear that Trotsky would take over a communist Spain. That was a fear that kept Stalin up at night. Now it looks kind of ludicrous. It was, there wasn't the kind of organization for something like that to be possible. But I think,
I think you are wrong.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
I mean, yeah,
it wouldn't be the first time.
So the civil war in Spain is very interesting. So the experience in the Civil War is what led George Orwell to write his books. Did you know that?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. He was there, George Orwell, and he wanted to register in the anarchist militia, but he couldn't because they were full. So he registered in the Pong militia, which were the Trotskyites. So in Spain, the Trotskyites were a huge force. And then, so the Republic, the so-called Republic, because it was not a Republic anymore, when the Civil War started, had three main parties that were fighting besides the army that supported them, that supported the government. And the three arms, let's say the three branches, were the Stalinists, the Trotskyites, and the anarchists. And Orwell was with the Trotskyites because he was unable to be with the anarchists. And then he saw how the Stalinists, despite being at war with the Frankists, and despite the war being undecided, started to eliminate the anarchists and the Trotskyites. And that's why he wrote Animal Farm. Animal Farm comes from this experience in Spain.
Interesting. You don't see it as a commentary on the 1917 revolution and the experience of the Soviet Union. I mean, that's the most obvious thing, right?
No, of course.
But this is what alerted. This is what gave him the firsthand knowledge.
He was a sympathizer of the Soviet Union.
Of course, yeah.
You know what I mean? Yeah. Until he lived this, and then I think there are two peaks in Animal Farm, a good one and a bad one.
Yes, and I Snowball is the Trotsky one, and Napoleon.
Or the anarchists, and the
and the Stalinists.
Yeah. So communism is really a movement that is born in the West.
Yes.
But it is a movement, it's a nihilist movement. So it's really a reaction against everything that belongs to the West. Because one thing I wanted to say, I don't know when you will close, but I wanted to say this, that the Western civilization is very important and for us to study. First, because we are Western.
Yeah.
But second, because it uh, he received especially two sources of knowledge and goodness that are universal. You know what I mean? So when the classics, Plato and Aristotle especially, they reflected on human culture in all its dimensions, political dimension, linguistic dimension, ethical, metaphysical, in all dimensions, scientific. They reflected, and they are classics because they were able to distinguish between what is parochial for the Greeks from the perennial measure. Yeah, so they were able to see this. Like, for example, Aristotle in the Interpretazione, on interpretation, he says, well, any language has statements, and any statement has a subject and a predicate, so at least substantives and verbs. Well, that's universal. That's not, you know what I mean?
Can I just give some terminology for this, because we've talked about this in previous podcasts, actually, both our previous podcasts, that one of the quintessential features of this Western philosophical tradition is the distinction between, let's say, the customary and the good, what is usual for our people and what is, simply right or just or whatever, and that is incredibly important.
And you see that, like, in Plato's work, you see that he gives you like the standards for morality that are rational. You just say, wow, this is true. But then he applies them to his own customs, usages, and he says, look, my friend, killing the defective babies is wrong. That's wrong.
Right.
You know what I mean? That's wrong.
Let me just set up the way that Marxism would be a challenge to this, and you can correct me. Yeah.
Let me. So Western civilization has this philosophy and science, because Thales discovered one very important thing that then it became ingrained in Greek science, and it came to the West. It came also to the Muslim world and to Byzantium. It's not only the West, which is general demonstration, necessary demonstration. Yeah, that's that. The West has that, and the other wing of the West that is revelation, and especially the incarnation. The incarnation. Those two events, let's say, the discovery of philosophy and science on the one hand, and the incarnation, the West witnesses. And Marx denies all that.
Both of those.
I mean,
right. You set that up very well.
Poem, in his poem, Ulanem, he says that all that is good and noble is only the fiction of the poets.
Right.
And in Communist Manifesto, he goes well beyond. He says all that the West holds as good is just ideology to exploit the man, to exploit men.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's a radical denial of anything that is good. That's Marxism.
Yeah. So I was gonna try to set up a little more specifically how the communist Marxist denial of a standard of good works with a critique of capitalism, for example. So let's say the liberal capitalists, people like John Locke, who I know you're not a huge fan of, but let's take things from my my Anglophilic side for a second. But I'm actually going to be describing Marx's critique of someone like John Locke. Someone like John Locke would say that there is a nature period that we could get back to, that we could say something about, and that we could begin to deduce conclusions from. So we would be looking at a basis that is not cultural. you could think of this as being like the distinction between the customary and the good. Here, it's not so much the good as it is the natural. And if we know the natural, we could then, from that, begin to think about what are natural ends that people seek. Someone like Thomas Hobbes would say it would be freedom from fear, freedom from death, this kind of thing. And we can begin to say what would be the correct form of social organization or political economy based on this, coming out of this natural base. I'm simplifying a huge amount. But for instance, we would say that everyone naturally seeks their own good. This is a basic liberal proposition, right? People want to seek their own good. And so when you unrestrain them, this is the way someone like Locke talks, when you remove restraints on their ability to seek their own good, they naturally do so. This means that they naturally try to acquire as much property as they can. And that makes capitalist society, in a real sense, natural. What is artificial is the imposition of mercantilism, for example, or forms of organization other than this. Now, someone like Marx would say that, as a matter of fact, how we got the capitalist labor system is not the result of the removal of impediments and nature flowing back in like a river, but in fact the imposition of impediments, a kind of semi-slavery. The Marxists might say that the population that were craftsmen, that were independent farmers, were kind of semi-enslaved into a state of wage bondage in which they would be then kind of laboring. And then the liberal theorist looks at this whole situation and says, well, this is simply natural. And the Marxist says, no, this is the result of essentially oppression. I'm interested to hear you comment on that, but I'll just throw in one more thing here. What this means philosophically is that anytime someone starts talking about what is universal, what is natural, the Marxist kind of reaches for their gun, so to speak, right? Now, there's a Marxist version of talking about what is universal, but there's a different Marxist understanding for why that could be justified. But that critique of the universal, that critique of the seeking after the good and the natural, I think that's very basic to Marxism. Now, I'm sure you'll have a response to that, and I would love to hear it. Is there anything on your mind?
There is a lot.
I know there is.
But well, one first clarification I want to make is that I think that the Anglo-Saxon tradition is much richer than just Hobbes and Locke.
Sure.
You know what I mean?
Sure.
There is much more than that. Hooker I find much better than Hobbes, and many other authors like Clarke I find much better than much better than Locke. I find Clarke and etc. But so there is a lot in the Anglo-Saxon tradition that is not, and there is a lot that is liberal in a different sense than Locke and Hobbes. Yeah.
I like Burke as a kind of example of a different kind of liberal.
Yeah. But there are many others, not really. But in the 19th century, when so let me tell this story, which is a bit parallel, I don't know, to this. In the 19th century, let's say the Kantian view of civil law was imposed, and according to it, the only thing that matters and makes just a contract is the will. So if the workers sign a contract, that contract is just because they sign it. And this was used by the industrialists to really oppress the workers, because the workers worked 7 days a week, 15 hours a day, men, women, and children, no limit, was horrible. But then in England, thanks to the tradition that is not of this kind only, thanks to the traditions. A guy named Michael Thomas Sadler rose in Parliament because he was Christian, and said, this is unacceptable. We cannot have this. We need to pass labor laws to protect the workers. They are not free to sign. If they don't sign, they will die of hunger. You know what I mean? This is just, it is exploitation. So Ashley understood, Lord Ashley, and said, you are right. We are going to protect the workers. And then a big movement was formed. Dickens was part of that movement, Charles Dickens. So they started to push the labor laws and to change the social landscape, let's say. So to this were opposed the industrialists, because they began to say, well, if you do this, you are going to be ruined because the machinery has a cost. We have to cover the cost of the machinery with the production, all this stuff. Okay, in the 40s, in 1844, already without Michael Thomas Sadler, Ashley's party was still promoting these laws. And the 10 hours work law was discussed, 10 hours per day. And then the German liberal philosophers praised this. But the industrialists in Parliament say, no, this is going to ruin us, the same story, because we cannot cover the loss of the machine value over the years if the workers work only 10 hours per day. Yeah. Well, Ashley proved that was not true, and the law was passed. You know who opposed that law besides the industrialists?
Who?
Marx and Engels.
I was hoping you would distinguish. I think we're getting there. So you can be a well, I'm not sure what the best word is here. Liberal. You use that word. You can be a liberal who wants to correct the excesses of capitalism without being a Marxist, and maybe in some places they would think differently.
Yeah, so that's it. But my point is, I'm going there. So you can see that in the Holy Family. The Holy Family was written in 1844, and you can see Engels and Marx side with the industrialists. But why? Why do they? Because one of the mottos of Marxism is the impoverishment theory. So the worse the situation is, the better.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? So they wanted the system to collapse, but they were opposing the measure, saying that it was going to make the system collapse. You know what I mean? And then in 1848, in the Communist Manifesto, they come and say that that law was due to their fight. You can read that in the Communist Manifesto. Marx very shamelessly says that that law was approved because of their pressure, which is not true at all, because Marx denies that there can be a person like Ashley or Michael Thomas Sadler or Dickens who just wants to do what is just. He states that everybody does whatever is his interest. So he doesn't know what to do with people like this. And then when he proposes like the complete abolition of philosophy, of justice, of freedom, of everything, and the opponents say, well, what are you saying? You should say you want a transformation of justice, of freedom, of... He says, no, because all those concepts are the result of the exploitation of man by man. Right. So when we destroy the whole system, all that will disappear. Yeah. Well, it's nihilist. Yeah. It's nihilist. It's pure nihilism.
Do you think it's? I mean, I know you do think it's nihilist, but I'll try to say the other side, which is also not necessarily going to be a defense of Marxism, but I actually think that Marxism is extremely ethical. It's just extremely lopsidedly ethical. It lacks a place for what I think are some pretty core principles of justice, such as property. That would be an example, although people do distinguish between private property and personal property. That's made sometimes. I don't totally buy the importance of that distinction. But I would say I actually don't think of communism as being truly ethical, and I don't think of I'm sorry, as being truly nihilist. And the things that come from communism, various other kind of isms that talk about ideology, right? That call things ideology, and that's part of their argument. They don't simply argue about facts, and they don't simply argue about values. They argue that something is an ideology, right? You hear that argument of you're just repeating the ideological line, or saying that you're feeding into the ideology. I think that people are drawn to these for very ethical reasons, don't you? Everything, and Marxism,
I was thinking,
maybe especially.
I was thinking, Clay, that needs another podcast.
Oh yes, fair enough.
because to go deeply into that subject would be long. But it is true that people are drawn to Marxism for ethical reasons.
Yeah. So
like McIntyre.
Oh sure. Yeah.
McIntyre, even in his old age, he's drawn to Marxism. Yeah. You know what I mean? He's Christian, but he still thinks that Marxism has something good in it.
Maybe
he brings it in his work. So there is this. You are right on that. People are drawn for ethical reasons sometimes, but I think they are deceived.
Yes.
But why I say that, we have to talk. It's a long thing.
Maybe we could end by or begin to come to a close by saying what Marxism has done to Venezuela. And I know you could say much about this, but maybe in your own lifetime, how have you seen a transformation in Venezuela? We've talked about some aspects of this, the academies, things like this, but how has Marxism changed the Western civilization of Venezuela, which, as you said, it has a Spanish-American Western civilization? Is that intact? Has it been significantly undermined? What's the right way to think about how communism has affected Venezuela?
Well, that's also a long thing. We can talk about it too in another podcast, but I'm going to do a short sketch. Venezuela no longer exists. It doesn't exist. It doesn't have political unity. It's divided in several zones controlled by different gangs, and there are two overriding powers, which are China and Russia. We are full of Russian missiles. All our gold is taken by China without pay. The government doesn't care at all. So one of the goals of Marxism is to destroy nations. And Venezuela is destroyed. That's not a metaphor. Venezuela does not exist. So the part of Maracaibo is controlled by the Mexican gangs. The part of the plains is controlled by the FARC. The other parts are controlled by different Venezuelan gangs that are mixed with drug dealing. There is no, so the only overriding powers, the powers on top, are foreign powers, no local powers. Then, as I was saying, universities are destroyed. So that's essential to Western civilization, that you have a search for truth that is independent from political power. When you lose that, you lose the structure of Western civilization. And then they don't accept any influence of religion over politics. That is also a complete loss of the Western structure. Like even in 1998, when after almost 200 years of Masonic rule, let's say, the armed forces had a chaplain. You know what I mean? And different branches had different chaplains. And so that meant that the soldiers were not ready to just kill. For example, in April 11, 2002, that's a long story too, but Chavez was ousted for 2 days. And one of the reasons is because he commanded the generals in charge of the tanks to attack a demonstration of civilians. And one of the generals, who was a criminal, obeyed. But the others came out and confronted him and arrested him with the tanks. So they were not ready to just massacre thousands of people, because they had this religious structure in their minds that there is good and there is evil. You cannot do that. Well, that's wiped out. Now these guys are just criminals. And that's something very essential to Marxism. I say that the foundation of totalitarianism is the thesis on Feuerbach by Marx. Why? Because there is where he says that truth as correspondence between what you say and the world doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is whatever furthers the revolution. And that I saw in Venezuela so vividly. Like people who hasn't lived through a totalitarian regime being imposed in a country cannot imagine what that is. Like, you can't imagine what human evil means. You can't imagine that. It is something unimaginable for a normal person. It's impossible to imagine. But that is a result of the thesis on Feuerbach. But that, as I say, deserves another conversation, because that would take us very far. But the cruelty of these guys, for example, the way in which they torture people, the way in which they can kill small children, and they can torture. For example, one thing that it always moves me is that this story. There was a businessman who supported Chavez, and he was close to the vice president of Venezuela, Jose Vicente Rangel, who already died, thank God. He one of the evilest persons that have existed on this earth. Right? Yeah. So this businessman had a disagreement with Jose Vicente, with the vice president. You know what this guy did? Because of a disagreement, a political disagreement, with his ally, the guy who gave money for Chavez to win the elections and supported him. His name was Sindoni, his last name, if I remember correctly. I think it was Sindoni. Well, Jose Vicente had his 3 children kidnapped with the driver. They were missing for a month or something. And then they were found with the marks of torture that you can't imagine. All dead. It's something like, and the poor mother went crazy. The children were like 7, 5, and 3, something like that. One was handicapped. It's like, you can't imagine what these guys are. You can't.
I know that you're teaching the Communist Manifesto right now to University of Florida students. As a closing, why do you think it's important to teach Marx to today's students?
Well, Brooks told me the other day.
Brooks is our colleague in the Hamilton Center.
Yeah, exactly. Who was in the podcast too,
yes,
right?
Yes.
Yeah, he told me this story that I had forgotten, but I think it's a very good one. He said that Reagan used to say, a communist is a person who reads Marx. An anti-communist is a person who actually understands Marx.
That's great. Well, Carlos, I could talk to you forever, and we'll have you on the podcast many more times, I'm sure. There are a lot of threads here that I'd like to pick up that I'm sure will furnish many, many more conversations in the future. But I just wanted to thank you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing your knowledge. I have never heard you repeat a story. I have heard you tell so many stories, Carlos, and yet I've never heard the same one twice. You're just a repository of not just information, but also perspective and deep wisdom and experience too. So I'm very, very grateful to have you as a colleague, and very grateful as well that you decided to come on the podcast.
Thank you, Clay. Yeah.